Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a two-panel event, Small Satellites, Big Missions, the implications of the growing small satellite market for launch and key applications. Our first panel is going to look at the question of applications, missions for small satellites. Second panel will cover the transportation launch side of the equation. I'm going to begin, as we always do, with our safety brief, which is to say, if for any reason we had to leave this room due to a safety issue, I would be your safety officer and would give you directions either to go out the way you came in or, if necessary, to go out the back. But that is very unlikely to happen. But if something were to happen, look to me for direction, and I'll try not to panic. I also want to recognize the sponsor for today's event, which we always do, and we were able to put this together as a result of support from Strata Launch Systems, so we really appreciate their support. I'm not going to get too deep into the substance of this because you've got really smart people, much smarter than me, who are going to do that on these two panels, but I want to set the scene just a little bit. I think there's been a lot of discussion about small satellites and what they can do for the country, for the economy, also potentially for defense. We really want to drill down on that, not just on, sort of the out there possibilities or the far edge possibilities, but also to explore concretely in the near term what specific things can small satellites deliver to the market and potentially to the Department of Defense and to national security applications, which are always a focus here at CSIS. Historically, the government has been deeply involved in space, deeply involved in launch, deeply involved in space layers, but it has historically done that often by owning them and by launching its own systems, by building its own systems, or working with industry to build its own defined systems. And we appear to be going towards a new paradigm where the commercial sector, where industry is doing more of its own development for its own purposes. And that seems to be particularly true in the small satellite space. That's a niche area where the energy is much more so on the private sector side. But that doesn't mean that there are significant uses in defense for where that's going. How might the Department of Defense access that? Historically, as I mentioned, it hasn't always purchased space services. The government has tended to approach space more as an organic domain for its own activity. How do you use all these products that are out there on the market? How do you access them if they're coming from non-traditional sources, not the usual players, which hasn't always been DoD strength? How might you use these services to add resiliency to DoD's own systems, to complement the organic space infrastructure? And oh, by the way, what do you do with all this data? One of the major outputs of all these things, massive volumes of data. How do you handle that? So those are just a few of the issues. I'm sure our panelists are going to surface, quite a few more. You will suffer sitting out there listening. But without any more suffering listening to me, I'm going to ask Todd Harrison, my colleague here at CSIS, to come forward. He's going to moderate the first panel.
While I'm talking, I'm going to ask all the panelists to go ahead and come up on stage and take their seats. And I want to go quickly to a chart we want to throw up here on the screen that talks about the increase in the small satellite market that's projected for the near future. So I want to thank our folks at Avocent for giving us access to this data. They maintain a database. And what you can see here on this chart, the lighter gray section there is the projected growth and the number of small satellites launched every year. I started early in my career working in the aerospace industry at a small satellite company. That's actually where I met Aaron. We both worked at AeroAstro back in the day. We won't say how long ago that was, but we were probably in middle school at the time. Back then, that was a time when we also saw a lot of hope, a lot of big plans for building small satellite constellations. And it looked for a time like this sector of the industry is really going to boom. That didn't happen for a lot of different reasons. And so you can see where we've been for the past several years is fairly flat in terms of the satellite market. We've seen some growth, some uptick here in very recent years. But a lot of the big growth you see out there in the future, it's still in the future. And so that's what people are struggling with now, is this real? Is it going to happen? And so that's what we want to talk about on the panel today. And so I'm going to just go down the line here and ask each of the panelists to give some introductory remarks, and then we'll have a Q&A session, and we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So as you're hearing the discussion, please, if you've got a question, take a note, and we'll give you a chance to ask at the end. And so here, I'm going to transition to sitting down here. All right, so I'll start to my left here with Dr. Bill Jeffries, CEO of SRI International. He previously served as the director of the National Institutes for Standards and Technology, NIST, back in the Bush administration. Also served as a deputy director of the Advanced Technology Office at DARPA. So a lot of great experience. And so, Bill, why don't we start with you?
Well, thank you very much, and I'd like to thank CSIS and the sponsors for hosting today. Hopefully it will be an informative and fun day. So as I was thinking about this, it struck me that if you allow me a lot of liberty with history for a second, we could actually view this October as the 60th anniversary of the first small sat launch, because that was when Sputnik 1 was launched. Now, Sputnik 1 was about the size of a beach ball, okay? It had a whopping transmit power of 1 watt, okay? And think of how much that cost to build and launch that in those days. Now, in the decades since then, we've gone down a path where we've been spending a lot of resources in building much more capable systems. Those much more capable systems mean much bigger, much heavier, and typically much longer time on orbit, as well as longer time to build and design. Well, what's happened over the last decade or so, although it doesn't necessarily show up as much on that chart, is a shift towards being able to build really capable systems in really small volumes. And if I go back to the Sputnik for a second, if you put that into today's language, Sputnik was about a 100U configuration, and it was a 1 watt beacon. Think of what we could put into orbit today at 100U type of configuration. So the technology has definitely opened up a whole new paradigm for what we can do. So I tried to think about some of the ways that this could, as we look towards the future, really start to impact both the national security as well as the civilian side. And so there's a couple areas where I think small sats may play a huge role. One is that the lower barrier to entry really opens up a whole new avenue for training the next generation of space engineers. I remember many, many years ago when I was in the White House at OSTP, AIAA had published a wonderful report that talked about the number of aircraft designs that a typical aerospace engineer would work on in their lifetime. And in the 1950s, it was about a dozen or 15, dropping down to about 1 right now because the time frame of building those systems was so much longer. And the quality of the engineering experience by not being able to build a little, test a little, was a detriment. Well, small sats changes that whole paradigm for space. It allows engineers the opportunity to actually build a little, test a little, try out new concepts, really risky experiments, things like on-orbit servicing, refueling, space manufacturing, all the kinds of things that we would love to have that would also benefit national security, but it's too risky to do in the traditional way of doing that. There's also, it's opening up whole new avenues for the commercial side. There's a number of startups. Venture capital has now suddenly recognized that small sats exist, and they're starting to get interested in how they can play in space. So you're going to see this wave of, from Silicon Valley and others, of now playing more and more into space. That will manifest itself in a number of ways. Probably the earliest, as shown up there, is going to be mostly communication satellites and also additional imagery satellites. So what does that mean for both national security and for the civilian side? when you've got revisit times, for example, of imagery way down. Okay, how can NGOs, for example, use that to help predict where the next famine will be or where the next migration will be, where they may be able to get in early and help? Right now, that access is a lot more difficult. Governments can start to think about architectures in a different way. Rather than one single giant Battlestar Galactica, can you disaggregate them? Can you, if you don't need simultaneity in the operations, perhaps a disaggregated architecture actually becomes more robust. And so there's that kind of options. Launch on demand, right? We've been talking about this for, I don't know, at least 20 years since I've been in the Beltway, of getting launch on demand. That not only provides the Department of Defense a robustness in terms of being able to replace systems that may be lost on orbit, it allows a surge capacity. And that surge capacity can allow for new geographical regions that weren't necessarily planned for in advance, or it can provide new capabilities. And the last thing that I want to talk about is something that we don't always mention when we talk about small sats, which is the ability to have a huge number, a constellation of hundreds of systems up there that can exploit new phenomenology. If you've got something that you're looking at that is highly dynamic, that you need in situ measurements, and you want continuous global coverage, that is something that the traditional large systems cannot do. So let me give you an analogy. If you wanted to forecast what the weather is going to be like in Washington, D.C. tomorrow, and the only thing you had was a single thermometer in Kansas City, how good do you think that would be? Right? There's a number of systems in the space environment that are highly dynamic, that you want high temporal coverage, and that you want a lot of spatial coverage. Space weather, radiation environment, looking at subtle changes in the Earth's magnetic field, looking at 3D continuous structure of the Earth's atmosphere, looking at mixing. Those are all deep science questions that we don't actually have the capability of addressing today. And then move that to something like the Jovian system, and it gets much more complex. So I'm actually very, very bullish that as small sats continue to develop and the launch capability, particularly getting very low-cost launch access, that we're going to really be able to rewrite some of the scientific knowledge of what we've got of the Earth's atmosphere and the planetary systems around us. So with that, I'll turn it over.
All right. And so next up, I want to turn to Colonel Bhutto, who is the West Coast Military Lead for the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, which is more commonly known as DIUX, member of the California Air National Guard, correct? And also previously served as the CENTCOM Deputy Director for Joint Search and Rescue Center during Operation Enduring Freedom. And so, Colonel, I want to go to you and see if you can give us some insights into what's DIUX doing in small space, and what can small satellites do for the military?
Sure. Well, first, for those not familiar, DIUX was created by the former Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, in order to permit the DoD to reach out and engage with non-traditional innovators. So non-traditional just meaning our traditional innovators are those within the defense industrial base. And there's a number of technical areas where the advances are just exploding in the commercial sector, as our moderator brought up earlier, where we have some, usually our tie into those areas is through the labs. But the maturity of those things into our normal programs of record take time. And I want to caveat my remarks by first saying that big sats are very important to us, right? So our exquisite systems, our national technical means, there's no replacing them. They are absolutely essential for what they do and what they provide. So our interest in small sats is really not that, but it's the convergence of a couple of different innovations, if you will. One is obviously, actually the first CubeSat was actually just a mobile phone, right? In I think it was a 1U bus, and just to say, hey, what if we apply this technology? And what it showed is well, mobile electronics operate just fine in that environment with a little bit of engineering. But it's the combination of those low-cost sensors with the advanced analytics that are emerging right now. And also, as the next panel will discuss, the advent of more frequent access to space through commercial means and diversified options, ranging from rideshare to being able to put things precisely where they need to be, hopefully in short order. So normally when the DoD does business with the commercial sector, we go through something called FedBizOps, which if you're a high-tech company in Silicon Valley, Boston, or any of our ecosystems, they don't even know what that is. So we have to be boots on the ground out in these technology sectors, and then relying on our relationships through the labs, such as SRI and others, to find out who these people are, what they're doing, and enable them to prototype their commercial capabilities with the idea that we want to assess their ability to add to our understanding of the environment. So we are specifically right now, our first space project, we're funding commercial synthetic aperture radar microsatellites, and it's a competitive program. The wonderful thing about it is when we started, there were 0 U.S. commercial providers of SAR, and so we're funding that. We're funding analytics companies to work with them, with the idea that we're launching a capability to look at patterns of life. What are those things that could serve as peacetime early indications and warnings of things that we need to know about? And the wonderful thing with that is it's the ultimate big data problem, because we need to ingest a lot of data from everywhere, not just focusing on specific targets.
So next we'll turn to Dr. Bahia Law, who's a research staff member at the Science and Technology Policy Institute within the Institute for Defense Analysis. And I happen to know that she has been recently doing work looking at trends in the small sat market space. And so, Bahia, I want to turn to you and see what are you finding that's going on in the industry?
Thanks, Todd. So there was a Star Trek episode, or original series, where they run into this species who don't understand what children are. So they're trying all different ways to explain what a child is, and then Captain Kirk just gets frustrated and says, they're like humans, only smaller. So, it seems to me that for a lot of people, a small sat is like a traditional sat, only smaller, and it costs less. So it just seems like such a great idea. Why would we pay less? But so I want to make 5 points in the 5 minutes that I have, and that's my first one. That small sats are a fundamentally different entity. Yes, they're smaller, they may cost less, but they also offer a different set of capabilities. And I think both Bill and Colonel Bhutto talked about some of that. And I think my second point is that unlike the exquisite NTMs, small sats are just a different value proposition. Sometimes you don't need a Ferrari to get to where you want to go to work. A Ford Focus is good enough. And I think in some ways, small sats are that. Whether you're doing Earth observation or satellite communication, or even things like detecting incoming asteroids or discovering exoplanets. They offer a capability that maybe not at the same level, but it's something that is in the interstitials. And if I had to try to kind of put into buckets the application areas that my preceding panelist talked about, sort of there is a risk-taking bucket that you can take more risks. They are cheaper, so you can do different things. You can experiment. The second bucket I would call speed. So the Mars rover, the Curiosity, had a 1 megapixel camera, and the reason for that was the design was frozen 10 years ahead of time. Now, Canon just came out with a 250 megapixel camera. So if you can refresh your satellites more often, not, maybe even every few months, you can put a lot more capability because you can move much farther with Moore's law, as I think Bill talked about. And the third piece is new capability, things that we just couldn't do before. So expendable platforms, you can do research in very low Earth orbit. You couldn't put spacecraft there because they just degraded too quickly. Or, Bill mentioned constellation, simultaneous multi-point data collection, secondary lines of sight. You can see, you can have sister spacecraft that go with the mothership. So lots of really interesting new capabilities that you now have because you have small sats. So that was sort of my second point. My third point is that in some cases, small sats may seem to offer much less capability. Planet Lab resolution is 3 to 5 meters. But the interesting thing about small sats, like any other disruptive innovation, is they're moving relentlessly up the capability curve. So taking an example of attitude control, measure as pointing accuracy. We improved 2 orders of magnitude in 5 years, and the improvements are much faster than expected. So we would be another 2 orders of magnitude in the next year or 2, and that's really something. My fourth point is, while currently Earth observation and remote sensing and communication are sort of the initial killer apps of small sats, and they do comprise most of the activity today, the really interesting stuff is in other applications such as low-cost RPO services or space-based situation awareness. Things like space-based space situation awareness, things that we just couldn't do with smaller spacecraft. In theory, just with Earth observation and communication satellites, you can even close the case for the commercialization of space, and even potentially, the case for a launch. But a lot of it remains to be seen, which brings me to my well, I'll come back to that. My next point was, while it seems that small sat innovation is a very US-centric phenomenon, in our research we found that there's 70 countries in one way or the other involved in the small sat world, and it's a very international community. So, for example, Danish company GomSpace, they have their software-defined radio is for one of the best values in the community, or the Finnish company ISI, which is developing a small sat SAR platform. So I think it will take some effort to keep the cutting edge in the United States. We cannot take it for granted. And the last point I wanted to make, since I'm a little bit over my 5 minutes, is that a lot of the capabilities I'm talking about are in the future. And I think we really do need to remember that we don't get overtaken by the hype. And just a few days ago, there was this article that talked about how Rocket Lab, which is a small sat launcher, has had one launch, not the ideal orbit. They're valued at $1 billion. Arianespace, which is, it's been around forever, 80 some launches without any flaws, it's valued at $500 million. So there's a lot of really, there's excitement in the community, which I think we need to capture, but we just do need to know that investment is a sign not of success of the sector, it's a sign of interest in the sector. And we should just keep that in the back of our mind. And so the point being, while there's a lot of potential to change the space domain, let's not count our chickens ahead of time. There's a role for government here, and I guess in the rest of the discussion, maybe we can talk about, what that role is. Thanks.
And so last up on our panel for opening comments is Aaron Rodgers, who's Program Manager for Disruptive Space Missions at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. And so Aaron, want to go to you and get your take on what can small satellites do, and what's the disruptive change that's coming?
Sure, thank you. One of the challenges of being the last on the panel is to adjust in real time to all the remarks said by your colleagues. And so I share a lot of their common sentiments and thank them for setting the stage for some of my remarks. So I'd like to try to add something new to the conversation, which is what is the right size of a small satellite? And I think that question has been asked by lots of people for so many years. And I think, historically speaking, it's driven a lot by launch and space access. And even going back a few years, the only way to get to space, if you weren't buying a dedicated ride, was first entry was to go as a CubeSat, a 3U CubeSat. And so fast forward to present, we're seeing a lot more access to space and form factors much larger than 3Us, now 6Us, 12Us, conversations of things much larger than that. We're seeing these new commercial rideshare options, dedicated commercial rideshare programs offered. And so that's in the rideshare community. We also have a panel to follow that will talk about access to space for dedicated low-cost launch that can provide also measures of schedule continuity and confirmation, as well as resilience and responsiveness that comes through dedicated launch. So there's excitement about space access now, and that's really important. The other thing is you think about sort of the size of satellites is once you decouple the launch access component is what's the mission need? And the first thing people think about is, what's an aperture we need for a picture of the resolution of a ground? What's the antennas and elements of the payload accommodations? And once you can decouple the launch opportunities and now let yourself to think more what's driven by the mission need, you can think about larger form factors. And we actually looked at this a few years ago at a study and found there was sort of a nice gap class of missions, which we sort of proposed to be called express class, and that was somewhere between a 3U and a 6U and an ESPA or steamer trunk size satellite system. And that was one that was postured to take better advantage of rideshare opportunities, but also give more physical payload accommodation provisions. Size, weight, and power, namely to operate the payloads, the CONOPS and duty cycles of those missions, as well as most, at the cost point view, take advantage of commercial technology off the shelf more readily. When you go to small form factors, 3U CubeSats, you oftentimes need to spend a lot of money to miniaturize and package your system as opposed to using what exists and what's got a high maturity form factor. And so with larger form factors now moving forward, we're seeing the opportunity to take advantage of those new cutting-edge integrated subsystems much more readily. I'll point out that traditional small satellite systems tend to have a density of about that of water, a gram per cubic centimeter. And we're seeing new small sats being built right now that are more 50 to 70% greater than that. And so we're seeing highly integrated electronics taking advantage of commercial packaging techniques and other state-of-the-art technologies to really drive technology up, as well as to put that in very small form factors. Of course, driving all this is a desire to do, as was noted, field constellations and heterogeneous architectures to support lower cost, high performance, higher temporal and spatial resolution and diversity and global access. And so all that sort of coming together as technology is marrying with launch access and the application space is coming together. And so we see a very good confluence that the government and the commercial sector is really drawing upon now. I will point out just a few challenges that we still see ahead of us, and it was noted by some of my panelists, is that this confirmation that the proffered performance and quality of some of these new offerings has not yet been realized. There's still quite a few that are in sort of early stage pitch mode and have actions and plans to get to orbit and demonstrate themselves, but there's still rubber meets the road in that respect. And that takes typically a couple years beyond that Series A round of funding to see those demonstrations occur. Some notable examples that I can think of in recent times was some of the hyperspectral imagery missions being proffered by Boeing and by OmniEarth, and those programs don't exist as flight programs. They moved into analytics, but not the barrier entry with the satellites themselves. Also, the notion of architectural integration is still a big issue. How do you take the commercially produced data and knowledge products and bring those into the systems that the government and other consumers are used to using? There are good proof positives that this can be done, and recent data buys from NGA for Planet and GPS radar occultation data by NOAA are clear intentions of this desire. Lastly, the notion of pragmatic balance between cost, schedule, and risk as it pertains to system reliability and availability. As we try to seek and utilize the latest cutting-edge technologies in the market, we have to recognize that there's not going to be lots of maturity data or other information to indicate how well that performance will survive in space, and so we have to balance and temper sort of expectations with regards to outages or mortality, which can be in opposition to traditional norms. I had 4 items, which I should say the last one is sort of architectural resiliency and timeliness issues that are driven by ground network access, and how do we build robust networks that we can use and access. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks. Thank you.
Okay, well, the first question, I want to go down the line here and ask each of you to comment on this idea of resiliency, picking up on what Aaron was talking about there at the end. The U.S. military and the Air Force in particular have talked a lot about the need to improve the resilience of our space capabilities in recent years, and part of this is because we're seeing proliferation of threats around the world. But you look at our military satellite constellations, and for the most part, our constellations have a small number of large satellites. And you look at this most recent budget request, and there's beginning the early stages of follow-on programs for advanced DHF and for SBIRS, for missile warning and protected comms. And we appear to be continuing to do the same thing, buying a small number of large, highly aggregated, very expensive satellites that are going to take a very long time to build and put onto orbit. How can small satellites help improve resiliency for military space systems? Do you want to start?
Sure. So thank you. So I think there are a number of ways that small sats will ultimately help the resiliency. I'd like to start off by echoing something that Bahia said, that a lot of this is in the future. And as one builds a robust architecture, a resilient architecture, it also has to have relatively low risk when it goes up. And so what I think you would see is a time shift where initially it's going to continue, the constellations are going to continue looking like they look, but over time, as the small sat capability becomes a reality, I think you'll start to see the architecture being able to blend in, and either you get a heterogeneous system from day one, or you get the ability to quickly replace or surge on a time scale that's much shorter than the traditional constellations to supplement the existing things. But again, it's going to be sort of proof in the pudding first, and I think we've seen that already with things like imagery, where national security has adopted some commercial imagery to supplement the capabilities of existing systems. But it's got to be proven to be real before it can go operational.
As tempting it is to talk about strategic resiliency, I'm going to actually talk instead about industrial resiliency, because the one thing I've observed firsthand since being at DIOX, I mean, we have some great companies that will work on developing our cutting edge technology. It takes a while for these satellites to get employed, and then they last forever. And what do you do with these guys in the meantime? And a lot of these companies, they get fewer and fewer by the day, and you don't have that churn so that you have the mentors training the next generation of engineers. So that alone is there's not a lot of resilience in that model, and I think we've seen gaps just in space over the 60 years that was talked about earlier. So the nice thing is when you bring in these commercial solutions, just as was mentioned earlier, you could take more risk, you can experiment, you can do things that you can't do with these large programs of record, and at the same time you can be seeding the technology. We're actually working on a battery project right now, because the lithium-ion batteries for that small form factor just ain't going to cut it. And if you're going to incorporate the latest, greatest battery technology on our expensive systems, you want to build some space heritage first. The commercial options are the best way to do that, because it allows the labs to get into space not just fast, but on a recurring basis. So we can do agile experimentation and development without really sacrificing a lot. And then those technologies will find their way over into the other side, but also keep a lot of smart people gainfully employed between the real big projects that they do every 20 years or so.
So without repeating anything that Bill or Colonel Bhutto said, I think one thing we should point out is that, you mentioned the large number of launches coming up. 80% of these are commercial. So I think we can assume that if there's any resiliency expectations, they would be from commercial industry. And that is where it actually gets interesting and complicated, because a lot of the companies that we looked at aren't using radiation hardened parts. They're using cheap COTS parts. They are not their standards for cybersecurity aren't as high as our traditional NTMs or even non-NTMs are used to. They are proposing commercial-oriented approaches. They are, as I think one of the panelists said, they are looking at global markets. And so, if there's a lot of money coming from an adversary at time of war, it's unclear that we can just assume that every commercial actor is going to be on the side of the United States. I mean, it's not like the aircraft model where we can just take over the airlines. I think in order for some of that to happen, we need to take action to make sure that in time, whether it's peacetime or wartime or whatever, we are able to leverage these commercial small sat developments, which means there needs to be support. So we did some interviews as part of some work we were doing, And one thing we heard from a lot of the DoD and government folks is, we'll wait and watch. Let's see them get successful on their own, and then then we'll purchase. We'll be a customer. We'll be a consumer. And I think that's all well and good, but then we have to be prepared for the possibility that these companies may move overseas. They may have enough customers overseas that their products are customized to other countries' needs. And it doesn't have to be anything nefarious either. I mean, let's say if Tyvek has customers in Norway, a lot of what their algorithms are going to be focused on water-based analysis as opposed to land-based analysis. And I think we would need to be okay with that. So I guess my bottom line is that in order for this resiliency to be planned and for it to be real, we need to make plans. We need to figure out how it's going to happen and not just assume that, oh, well, we have a commercial sector. They have small sats. We're all set.
So, Aaron, I'm realizing I put you again at the end. Next question, I'll start at your end.
All right.
Well, what's left to say?
Well, I was just going to add that I think the points are made that we're not looking at replacing exquisite systems, but rather complementing and augmenting them. That's an important point to reemphasize. And I think as the government looks at opportunities to leverage commercial endeavors, technologies, and programs and capabilities, the question that many of our sponsors are looking at is, do we want to develop and source from them an integrated solution or a dedicated solution? Meaning, do we want to buy data from them, or do we want to stand up our own duplicative system that leverages product line capabilities of those? And that really drives to a point of a business model of the companies. And so we're seeing both an appetite early stage of these startup companies to want to work with the government and government sponsors to do pathfinders and get their boots on the ground. But really, their venture cap backers in many cases are looking at markets that are well beyond that of a very stable government market. And so we see a divergence occurring down the road. And so how does the government access the commercial market capabilities, but at the same time recognize that there's not necessarily a long-term relationship that may be enjoyed at present? So I think that there's a rising tide here, but there are still questions to be worked out.
And so I'll start at your end then, Aaron. So my last question before we open it up for questions from the audience is, if we want to see the small satellite market succeed this time around, what does the government need to do, or what does the government need to stop doing to help enable this to occur?
Well, that's a great question, and I hate to start with something as dry as mission assurance or risk posture and that sort of thing, but when we talk about trying to embrace all of the good aspects and momentum and resources being drawn into the commercial sector for government purposes, we have to recognize that there is going to be some lessons learned and crawl, walk, run, and experiences that may not be successful off the gate. And so part of that is tempering expectations and learning to understand that the risk posture is a little bit atypical in that respect. At the same time, engaging the companies and communicating expectations, perhaps providing resources to help make them successful are ways in which that risk can be mitigated in some respects. But I think the dialogue needs to be not just give me what you got, but also let's try to strike some common grounds to how we can work together is going to be essential.
Bahia, thoughts?
I like lists, so I'll give you a list. What does the government need to do? I mean, I think one thing the government has to do is fund upstream R&D. So, emerging areas of technology, optical communication. I mean, absolutely, there needs to be some government investment in it. Technologies which are not of interest to commercial actors. Active debris removal. I mean, I think that's something the government needs to invest in. So that's the first area, R&D for upstream activities. Second one, risk reduction. I mean, there's all these technologies that we have. It would be useful for the government to participate in as either a public-private partnership or be leaders to figure out how to take it to a level where we can, they are routine. Third ones, and actually it's a boring one, but if you interview industry, that's the first thing that they tell us is industrial commons. We want databases. We want to know what components work. We want to know what is the history of a particular system. We want to know. We want testing facilities. We want thermal vacuum chambers, that sort of thing. So the government has a role there. The next one is supporting standards. Whether it's a CubeSat standard or some other sort of small sat approach. I think this one may be a little bit controversial, but something to think about, subsidizing launch. Especially if there's emerging new technologies that won't get venture funding or that sort of thing. Next one, and I think that's the one we talk about a lot, just being a customer. And DoD and NGA and NOAA and NASA are all doing a good job there trying to purchase and supporting industry by being a customer. And last but not least is regulation. And by that I don't mean create regulation or impose regulation, but just think about what are the sorts of things we need to think about. What do we need to do to make sure we have safe on orbit activity, or what should be the standards for image resolution. And again, maybe there isn't any, but we need to just think about it. That's the role of the government, I mean.
Yeah, so one of the things you mentioned there is, the government being a customer and buying some of the services or capabilities that are being provided. So, Colonel Bhutto, what is DIUX doing to be a good customer?
Yeah, we're pretty opinionated on this. So we think the government needs to be an outstanding anchor customer. So for a lot of these are a lot of emerging startups, new ventures, and we don't fund 100% of anything. When we don't put out a laundry list of requirements, we put out a problem statement, and the companies respond by saying, here's how our commercial solution can solve your problem. And by doing that, we're not reinventing these companies by just doing business with them, right? So we test that model of using their commercial solutions to solve our problems, and so that's really good. But when they have difficulties, which they invariably do, we have a wide range of resources at our disposal, so we can bring technical assistance to them. So I think, we don't always have to do the government subsidy, although I think that's something more on the launch side. But a lot of times, the best assistance we can do is just give the technical assistance, or steer them away from doing things maybe we've got some experience in the past. And I will echo one other thing, which is very important, is that we have to be on the leading edge of the policy and regulation, because a lot of the policies and regulations that are there were crafted decades ago, and we've made some decisions in the past that have impeded the evolution of commercial space industries in the United States, when the Europeans, the Canadians, and the Japanese did not. So we have to be competitive, as an industrial nation. So,
Bill, what are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, no, my thoughts are I'm feeling really sorry for Aaron for the last two rounds. So that was a very, very complete answer. I agree with absolutely everything that was said, and the only thing that I would perhaps embellish is that traditionally, right, the role of the government should be to help create the appropriate environment or ecosystem for the private sector to succeed. And in addition to the basic science, which tends to not be supported by industry, the regulatory environment, the legal liability issues and all are absolutely critical. And I know that the legislative branch is now starting to look at this very seriously. I know the House Science, Technology, and Space Committee just dropped a bill on, I think it was called the Space Commerce Free Enterprise Market Act. It's a catchy name. And in that, they actually cover a lot of the basic ideas that have been discussed. It's actually a very, I think, forward-leaning draft bill. And but I think that that's, again, an important role for the government to help not create wealth, but to create the environment by which industry can create wealth and capability.
Okay, so with that, I want to open it up to questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone over to you. So let's start over here. And please state your name, let us know where you're from.
Steve Welby, I'm representing myself. The chart that you put up at the beginning, Todd, you expressed your general skepticism, as you often do, about kind of hockey puck curves like that. But much of the growth people are talking about assumes the economies of scale and risk and cost that are going to drive this. I'm curious from the panel, what do you see in the near term over the next 12, 24, 36 months? Are there indicators that we're likely to see that are going to tell us whether we're going to see this explosion or not? What are the early warnings of success or failure in this emerging market? Thanks.
Thoughts?
A couple interesting markers that I've seen as pertains to constellations like OneWeb, who have looking to launch 1,000 satellites plus, is how do you achieve a price point that makes that profitable and economical, and that trickle down effect of having expectations of trying to build a $500,000 satellite delivered to launch vehicles is the supplier chain that are trying to feed in that. And so we're seeing evidence of suppliers that would traditionally support star trackers that may have been $500,000 now selling them for $5,000. And so we are seeing people trying to innovate and work within, of course, large-scale contracts to support these large-scale production activities. And then correspondingly, how do you bring together those pieces? Well, as large investments in the upfront and a rate to develop automation, integrated test, and production line assemblies to support those kinds of activities. And it's that's the only way they can achieve the throughput to create 1,000 satellites within a meaningful period of time. And so it's a pretty large what do you call it? Sphere of influence that's being touched by these large programs.
I guess the one I would add is NOAA has just given out its first license for an on-orbit operator. So again, it's a positive sign. Again, it's not something that's going to put 1,000 satellites up in LEO, or GEO, but it's a sign.
I'm going to throw my weight behind it. It's really going to come down to the launch, a small launch, because the commercial small sats are really only become interesting, I think, at scale. And you can put a lot of them up, but they have to be in the right orbits. Rideshare, my opinion is that rideshare is incompatible with commercial satellite constellation employment. You can't have this random way of just throwing stuff out. And on a DoD side, we wouldn't be very good stewards of space if we're paying to put a lot of small things in unpredictable orbits. So it's imperative that we get a small launch, and that every payload can be a primary payload. In other words, we have to be able to get every small satellite to its mission design orbit. And that's not a small feat. So, but there's a lot that we can do in the middle ground. But I do think that the success of this small commercial satellites is really going to be tied very tightly with launch. You can't have a constellation if they're all sitting in the barn waiting to go up.
Already said it all. Okay. Here, next question up front.
Thank you. Sandra Irwin, reporter with Real Clear Defense. I had a question for the Colonel. In your portfolio at DIUX, can you talk about some of the contracts that have been awarded under your portfolio? And going forward, what kinds of companies are you talking to? There's a lot of startups. Can you say a little bit about what the environment is like right now? Thanks.
Right. So one of our prime directives is that we always allow the commercial companies to decide when they want to announce that they're doing work with us, and it's not for all the reasons you think. Actually, a good portion of the companies that we work with are still in stealth mode, which means that they're doing developmentals, they're trying to get their strategic advantage, but they don't want everybody to know what's going on, and it's interesting to see. We've developed a good rapport and leverage a lot of the relationships established by the labs with the venture community. So that's how we get access to a lot of these emerging companies. There's two that I know that are at least discussed publicly. I think one is Capella Space, and another one, Orbital Insight. So there's an example of a small satellite company and a data analytics company. And the interesting thing there is that they're doing all the things that have been talked about on the panel, moving, feverishly towards this objective. Again, we only put in a small amount of money, and they're developing these commercial capabilities for not just a U.S. market, for a global market. So because we have this contractual agreement with them, and that's actually it's what we do our work under other transaction authority, which is a little exception to the federal acquisition rule. So we have a lot of flexibility, and what will happen is, and we do a competitive award, so it's not just those two companies, but we, over the course of the work, which will be 18 to 24 months, we follow milestones. We can continue on that course of work. We can rescope it. We might pivot if they were focusing on, let's say, the energy sector, and they move towards maritime. As long as it's consistent with what our end state is, we can pivot with them. Or to coin a very important phrase when we were set up, is the fail forward fast. We can experiment with the company, but if 6 months or a year into it, it just doesn't look like we're a good match, we can bow out, and they're still a commercial company, which is really great, because we don't want to create defense contractors. The idea is we want non-traditional solutions, and if it works at the end of this, the Congress has allowed us to be able to go to a sole source contract or to a production contract without having to recompete, as long as we do a competitive solicitation at the front end of this whole deal. So it's actually a lot of fun.
All right. Next question, right here. Bringing a mic around. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Pat Hose with Janes. Colonel, question for the Colonel. Can you talk a little more about this battery experiment? Maybe give us a timeline and a goal, and perhaps are you experimenting with new battery technologies that aren't commonly used right now?
So what it is our portfolios and our focus, we usually like to, we don't invent anything like the labs do. We actually look at where the hot, parts of the commercial sector are. And with the recent advent of electric vehicles, there's like big money going on, to find, better alternatives to lithium-ion technology. We're really pretty much just a little bit shy of the theoretical limit. But just like everything else we're looking at, there's these convergences of different technologies and metamaterials and our ability to manipulate things at the nanoscale. There's some great things going on that they're not quite in the commercial sector yet, but they're kind of at that tipping point. So that's why it's so invaluable that we, our chief scientist at DIUX, Dr. Bernadette Johnson, she's an alum of MIT Lincoln Labs. And so our Boston office is a half a mile from MIT. We're about a little more than a half a mile from SRI out in Silicon Valley. But I can go to coffee. I can get together with those guys, and they give us great ideas about who's doing stuff in the space. There's companies that spin out of the labs. And we like to keep track of those folks and what they're doing. So without getting into proprietary stuff, there's just a lot of interesting activity in this environment. And the wonderful thing is the companies that are doing this stuff are all wanting to produce cells that are about the size of a lithium ion cell. So when we talk to our satellite providers or our folks working on drones or anything else that are interested in battery technology, if it's cheap and they're able to take higher risk, we can bring these technologies in and test them. And for the duty cycle, to get these duty cycles from a double or triple where they're at right now, that's the equivalent of having a second or third satellite that you would have to launch otherwise. So it's really neat. What's a duty cycle? So a duty cycle, well, actually I'm gonna defer this down to our APL guy, because I know he can give you a better answer on it than me.
A duty cycle, the percentage of time that a payload or some device may be on is a function of an orbit or a rev or a day. While I have the mic, I'll just want to add one clarifying point, which is exciting to see all these new technologies coming forward, advanced manufacturing techniques, new battery technologies, mechanisms, things that really enable dramatic improvements in capability. The challenge we're seeing as the spacecraft and developer side, the payload developer side, the satellite developer side is really accelerating, is how do we then bring that back to the launch side and say, okay, this isn't a risk, it is a new battery you've never seen before, but trust us, it's not going to have a Samsung event, it's going to be okay. And other mechanisms, things of that nature. So there's it's an interesting, a bit of a strain gauge that's basically pulling back some of the advances because these people also want to launch their satellites. And so how do you verify that these will perform as expected? So it's an interesting choke system in some respects, but exciting.
Question right here.
Hi, I'm Travis Cottom from SAIC, and my question is referring to the 25-year orbital debris mitigation guidelines. So we have thousands of proposed small sats, a lot of which only will operate for a couple of years. And a lot of these companies want to have a high refresh rate so that they don't lose capabilities. Do you think that we need to start thinking about revisiting that timeline of 25 years, bringing it down, and when do you think that would be the right time to do so?
Who wants to take this one first? It's a lot of objects to be thrown up in space if you look at that chart.
We'll start in the middle since, I mean, we're very conscious about this, and I think it's unconscionable that we have CubeSats set up already for, a few months, and they're in, 25-year or more orbits. And but there's lots of good solutions to that. And I think what's really important is, being good stewards of space. And if we're helping to, if the government's going to do business with these companies, and we're going to be that outstanding anchor customer, well, we can set some rules of the road as well. There are technologies for deorbiting these things, and that are fairly mature. We don't have to put them in really high orbits. A lot of these sensors will actually perform much better in lower orbits than the higher ones. But it's something that it takes a lot of careful planning. We shouldn't be putting large numbers of these of CubeSats in the orbital altitudes with our manned spaceflight systems. And there's other good solutions using platforms and whatnot. But our intent is to try to spur the small launch community so that we have the ability to put all these payloads exactly where they need to be, and not by happenstance.
Bahia?
So to your point, yes, the 25-year guideline was arbitrary to begin with, and certainly we should have started yesterday to look at it again. So your point taken, but I just wanted to add a couple things. That the things to worry about, of course, we don't want debris in space, but the things you worry about are the things you worry about first are things like rocket bodies and other bigger things that are much more problematic before getting to the CubeSat. Small sat issue. Again, not to say that they should be irresponsible behavior, but we need to. So there's a study by NASA which is public, which really does look at debris by size and where So you need to be looking at the very small things and the very big things before you get to the 10 centimeter and above, 10 to 100 centimeters. So that's it. That was just a point to make. And then again, in addition to guidelines, there is. And there's other solutions, active debris removal. There's the issue of propulsion. I mean, right now, most CubeSats, no CubeSats have propulsion. And there's several companies and several organizations working on CubeSat and small sat propulsion. Those things are important to continue to focus on because you could maneuver them out of the way. So lots of things need to happen simultaneously, including looking at the debris mitigation guidelines.
I'll just offer that present day with the optic now shifting to very good stewardship of space, you're not going to launch a U.S. launch vehicle without some mitigation and deorbit plan that shows a timely deorbit, so you're not going to be resident for infinity. The question, though, was raised, which is how do you get down beyond your mission lifetime? And there's, as noted, several techniques for passive deorbit as well as other things that don't involve propulsion. So I think there's a much greater focus on being, like I said, good stewards of space. And companies are trying to go to space and bring satellites to orbit, like NanoRex to station, others going to ride shares, are trying to be very proactive in engaging NASA and others in those safety concerns.
And I would also just point out that a lot of these mega satellite constellations that we're talking about, they're going to have a vested interest because they want to keep using those same orbits for their follow-on constellations. So they're going to have an interest in making sure they don't create debris for themselves.
One rate tack, the liability never goes away. So if they're going to get, if you're one of these large venture firms, or or if you're on the board of directors of these companies, you're going to be paying attention to the fact that you don't want something with your brand name up there becoming a collision hazard for something else on a later date.
All right, other questions? We have one back over here on the right-hand side.
Hi there, Amy Camo from Bryce Space and Technology. So in order to have this spike in the small satellite industry, they have to be physically built and operated. Do you foresee any special pop-up companies that could come in and be a specific satellite manufacturer? Or do you foresee that the traditional bigger companies will take on these contracts and kind of pass on the buck to smaller companies that are already there?
All right. Who's going to build all these small sats?
So wait, so the question is, are there smaller manufacturers of small sats? Sorry, can you clarify? Yeah? Okay.
Do you believe that the traditional commercial companies that are already out on the market now, are they going to be the ones that are building the small sats in the future, or are smaller companies that are going to kind of pop up in the next few years, are they going to be the ones that specialize in these specific applications?
So it isn't smaller companies that will pop up. They already have. So a lot of the really interesting work is being done by the smaller companies. So there's a company called NovaWorks, which is developing sort of a Lego style satellite, which you can just build up. There's other companies like York System, which are developing completely new approaches to low cost and mass manufacturing of satellites. And there's a huge list of companies doing very interesting different ways of building satellites. But just to add to that, I don't think the big companies are sitting around. I mean, they are learning their lessons. They will be building. They will be catching up. So it'll be a very exciting ecosystem of a lot of innovation.
Well, and Aaron, what are you seeing down at the component level? Are there opportunities for new companies to get in? Like you said, the example of a star tracker before. Could a company get in that just specializes in star trackers that are very low cost for small sats?
That's a good question. I think if you looked at the state of the industry 10 years ago, it was a fairly blank slate, very limited suppliers, whereas now you've got a huge spaghetti mess of companies that are developing individual subsystem components that are also servicing their own satellite system needs. Some of those systems are also providing vertical integration for commercial offerings as well as product lines to industry. And so, yes, there are opportunities for new companies to get into the market and have new discriminators at price points or technologies. And I think that many of the companies that are offering the systems don't have a number of missions under their belt. So while they have perhaps a backlog of orders, there is still time to demonstrate performance in orbit and capture new markets. So I think there's opportunities out there. I will say that the larger traditional aerospace companies are looking at the very small companies that started organically and saying, your price points don't make sense to us. We can't make money building $1 million CubeSats or something of that nature. Maybe if you were to have an order that was 1,000 satellites, we could consider that. And so we're seeing lots of partnerships, investments, and certainly watchful eyes of the Lockheeds and Boeings of the small companies as to where they might evolve. So I think it's a fairly fluid market right now where there are opportunities, but some things are starting to coalesce.
Yeah, what I would add to that is, short answer is both. Right, and I think I agree with both what Bahia said and Aaron said, is small companies are popping up. They exist. There's a sort of within Silicon Valley and other places, there's sort of this almost bubble forming. Traditional companies are watching, but But I think one of the other things that's really exciting is beyond even the traditional small sat or the bus manufacturers and the launch vehicles, you're also seeing a sort of a secondary market of companies now starting to look at the data analysis of the products that would be coming out. We're also, SRI just spun out a company that deals with space tracking for particularly to tie into the commercial sector so that you could actually get a very accurate ephemeris of both where you are as well as where everything else in the neighborhood is. And so you're going to see this whole secondary and tertiary markets coming up as well.
You know, it's the government has an insatiable appetite for data, but it's unusable if we don't know the quality standards of the things that we're using to make these insights. And the challenge when you're dealing with non-traditionals, a lot of the new startup companies, is they can produce one or two, but can they produce 50, 100, or 1,000? And the good news there is that a lot of the money that goes into these companies is from investors who do a lot of microelectronics, mobile tech and things like that. And so the board of directors and the investors in those companies are going to force them to think outside the box. And Space Systems L'Oreal is a great example of a company in the San Francisco Bay Area that does a lot of traditional defense, but they're doing a lot more production type of things. And I think going back to that industrial resiliency I talked about earlier, I think that'd be a great way to build industrial resiliency is encourage some of our traditional companies to work on this, and that's another pathway for some of the technical advances to make it into our defense industrial base.
Yeah, Colonel, I'll just ask a comment, is that it'll be very interesting to see how Planet proceeds, given now they've got a mixture of the vertical Dove-developed systems with a SSL Terabella product in-house, so I agree.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I see we're running out of time here, so we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll pick up with our next panel looking at small launch. So please join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you.
Launch and the ability to launch this large number of small sats into space is to how this market is going to develop, how it's going to grow, and how it might then feed into some of the national security needs that we talked about for resiliency and other new mission areas. I'm going to start as, just for context, to kind of put a little bit of a sense of the space around this issue, again with a projection that Avicent did that we've got up on the screen. This one is on launches, okay? So the previous one was on satellites, large and small, and this one is on launches. And the attractive gray color is large launchers, and the more compelling red color is small launchers. So you can see, obviously, the history, which is that large launch has dominated for decades. I'm sorry, this chart only goes back to 2010, but for quite a while. And we know, of course, that it's been true in the past as well. And small launch has been a pretty thin red line there, but the projection is that it will substantially increase in 2017 and then really take off from there, essentially doubling, total number of launches doubling in the next 5 years, and the share of that, which is small launchers, growing very substantially. So that's one projection. There's probably many out there, but that just puts a little context around the issue that we want to discuss. I am going to introduce the panelists one by one as I recognize them for some brief opening comments. I'm going to start here with Marco Caceres, who is Senior Analyst and Director of Space Studies at the Teal Group. He's the creator and the lead analyst for the World Space Systems Briefing, and a former editor from Jane's. And I know we had Pat Host from Jane's here. I don't know if he's still here, but so some James alumnus. And Marco, I'd be interested in your take. You've been an analyst watching this space for a very long time, both the satellite side and the launch side. And I'd be interested in your take on where this market stands, what are some of the trends and the niches, and what might that tell us about how this market could serve the Department of Defense in some of these national security applications.
You just push the button. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Marco Caceres. I've been with the Teal Group for about a quarter of a century now. Our company analyzes markets and industries, primarily in the aerospace and defense area. My colleagues analyze missiles, aircraft, drones. I just happen to do launch vehicles and satellites. This expected boon in the market for satellites and launch services is kind of what we've been waiting for, what I've been waiting for the last 20 years. We thought it was going to come back in the 1990s when you saw the Iridiums and the Globalstars and the Orbcoms and others, and the teledesics that never happened. We thought it was going to happen in the early part of the last decade when you saw all these proposed big broadband geostationary communication satellites being proposed. None of that happened. Let me correct some of that happened. Iridium, Globalstar, Orbcom, they all happened, but the companies that you see in charge of that, those systems now, didn't exist back then. Those companies, those first generations companies, they went bankrupt because none of those systems cost what they were expected to cost in terms of developing, building, and launching them. They were much more expensive. So, for example, Iridium, that was projected to cost $1 billion, a system of 66 operational satellites at low Earth orbit, ended up costing over $5 billion. So when I hear either NASA or the U.S. military or any commercial company talk about the cost of their satellite or their launch vehicle or their constellations, I automatically multiply that cost by a factor of 5 or 10. 5 at least for the commercial companies and 10 for almost every government program. If you look at U.S. military satellite programs that are still in the pipeline and have been in the pipeline for 10 years, 15 years, they're all over budget. They're all facing cost overruns, significant in some cases by 100%, 150%, 200%. So with that, I think it's important to, when you look at these forecasts, be it the ones we do or the ones CSIS does, for the numbers of satellites that are being proposed to be built or that will be built and launched over the next 5 to 10 years, and the number of launch missions that it'll take to get them up to orbit, you have to be very skeptical about these forecasts because they really are educated guesstimates, certainly from 5 to 10 years out. And given how new this potential market is, even from 1 to 5 years out, is something you really need to be very careful about. We don't know a lot about these systems. We don't know, for example, much about SpaceX's 4,600 satellite constellation. We don't know where they're going to get their money. We know they have some fairly deep pockets, but we also know they have a lot of debt. They're partnering with Google. That's good news. Google has a lot of money. We don't know whether there's enough of a market for that size of a constellation and the one being proposed by OneWeb and the one being proposed by Boeing and a dozen or more other ones. They're targeting the same, pretty much the same markets. So I'll leave you with that. Just be a little skeptical when you see these forecasts.
You know, reminds me, of course, the famous Yogi Berra line about, you know, predictions are tricky even about the future. I like to supplement that as someone who looks at a lot of data that is past-looking, which is to say it's actually awfully hard to predict the past, too. It's awfully hard to look at data and figure out if you can say with clarity what really happened, even in the past. So it is a tricky business for sure. Next up, we have Steve Nixon. Steve's an old colleague of mine. I feel compelled to mention that back in the misty long ago days. It's so far down his resume because he's done so many great things since that it's not on my list to mention. But at one time we were colleagues on the Hill in the Appropriations Committee area. Steve now is Vice President for Strategic Development at Stratolaunch Systems. He's also the former Director of Science and Technology and the Chief Technology Officer for the Director of National Intelligence. And Steve, to be interested, you know, we've been hearing about the criticality of launch, some of the challenges of doing it. But I'd be interested in your perspective as a company that is getting into the launch business and starting to work in this space. And I would just also meant to point out, we don't have the usual launch suspects here on the panel. We wanted to bring in some new voices and get kind of that perspective. So please, your thoughts. And I should say, Steve actually has a few slides to speak to. I'm going to pass the arrow keys. We'll get the job done for you.
We have something to show off, and let's see if we can get those charts up.
I think you're in charge.
I have control, huh? No, I went the wrong way, maybe?
You have the call. You did. Just keep going.
There we go. Okay. Yes, I'm Steve Nixon, and I'm with a company, Stratolaunch. It's a Paul Allen company. Paul Allen is co-founder of Microsoft, and we are building the world's biggest airplane. To give you a sense of scale here, this is, the wingspan there is 385 feet long or wide, however you want to put it. That is longer, if you're a football nut, that's bigger than a football field that goes past the goalposts. If you're a baseball fan, that's a nice home run going from home plate out to the outfield. So a very, very large airplane and wingspan. And that plane is purpose-built to carry and drop 550,000 pounds, which would be a pretty sizable launch vehicle. And one that we start off working towards until we started seeing the trends of what's really happening in the space market, which is this real blossoming of the small sat industry. And so we've reshifted our thinking, and we're really focused on where that growth is in the market. And our first launch vehicle that we're going to have on the market is one it's venerable. It's been around for quite a while. It's Pegasus. We have the capacity to carry more than one. We could carry a whole slew. They only weigh about 50,000 pounds, so we could carry just a whole bunch. But we're starting off with 3. We think that there might be very strong attraction to that kind of thing in the national security market. So we're very interested in talking to folks there. And the reason being is that you and with one aircraft sortie could launch into basically launch an entire architecture of satellites into multiple planes, assuming that each launch carries multiple satellites. And so there in the bottom right-hand side, you see where you can go ahead and launch into those multiple inclinations. And we were very interested in this issue of resilience and what's happening with the threat to our space systems. It's been recognized in open forums by DoD that our adversaries view space as an Achilles heel for the U.S. military. General Hyten has said recently that our architecture, which was really built in an uncontested environment, is no longer resilient to threats and probably cannot operate through a contested military environment. So there's a big problem. And how do you deal with that problem? And yet, we have this architecture that works great as long as no one's messing with it. And so we've looked at this and think that there's an exciting capability for really a very modest investment. You can provide some amazingly wonderful things for national security and space resilience. And what we're proposing basically is adding a layer to our architecture of small satellites that duplicate the functions of what the rest of the architecture is doing. And what does that do for you? Well, one, it helps you with your deterrence situation, because now an adversary might only need to take out one satellite and really cause huge problems for you. When you have a lot of small, cheap satellites in low Earth orbit, then that changes their deterrence calculus. They'll have to think about how, because they won't derive the same benefit from an attack as they had before. 2, you have the capacity to surge things in LEO that you don't have in the other orbits, because these satellites don't take as long to build, they're cheaper, you can stockpile them, keep them on the shelf, and so you can have them available to surge when you want. The large billion-dollar satellites that go into geosynchronous orbit that require very large launch systems to get them there, you just don't really have a practical way of stockpiling those. They're just too expensive. Once you build them, you really need to get them up into space. So you do have that capacity here. And then in terms of once there is a conflict, if things start getting taken out in in space, you have the ability to reconstitute those things in LEO in these small sats that you don't have otherwise. And we believe that for just 1% of what we spend on national security space, you could add this layer both in terms of satellites and launch systems. So 1% as your insurance or deterrence capability that preserves the rest of your architecture seems like a really good deal. And maybe it's 2%, whatever. But you're looking at our current expenditures in national security space in the order of $30 billion a year. So 1% is 300 million, 2% 600 million. But you can do all this and more for those kind of dollar amounts. So we're very excited about this for the purposes of national security. We think Pegasus is a really nice system for that. And we do have other launch systems that we're going to be following up with later on so that Stratolaunch launches a whole family of things. But this is the one we're excited about talking about for now.
Okay. Next up, we have Dr. Richard Dalbello, who is Vice President of Business Development and Government Affairs at Virgin Galactic. He's a former director for space and aeronautics at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy in the last administration, former president of Government Affairs at Intelsat, and former president of the Satellite Broadcasting and Communications Association. And I can't think about Virgin Galactic without thinking about Spaceship One and
I have
the
a picture of that
excitement
too.
Well, that's great, and I have to. I apologize, but I'm just going to brag for a second. I actually have stood on top of the Stratolauncher when it was under construction, so it is. You can say it's the size of a football field and kind of think you know what that means, but it is mind-boggling how big this thing is. Truly mind-boggling. So, but Rich, over to you.
I have also climbed Mount Stratolauncher. It is truly impressive. Thank you very much. I want to make maybe a couple of quick comments. A lot of dialogue in the first panel about, where's the industry going, small, medium, large? Is it really going to be there on time? I think the thing that I would always caution is this is how markets work. And I think that in Washington, we all get it spun up about, did we get it right? What are we supposed to support? And the point is that this is not government money for the most part. This is the private sector doing what it does. So you have this huge demand signal that's coming out of the satellite industry that says, we think that there's a class of satellites that people are not relying on today that might be valuable in the future. They might be small, the size of a loaf of bread, or they might be the size of a microwave oven or a small refrigerator, but they're smaller than the large mega satellites. So what's happening in the marketplace is that the big guys are doing what you'd expect. The SpaceXs and PSLVs in India and other launch vehicles are figuring out how to launch many small satellites. Well, and at the same time, there's a whole new generation of launch companies, and Steve and my company fit in that new generation where we're trying to come up and be more targeted to that new class of satellites that are coming along. Now, we had a lot of dialogue in the last panel about the CubeSats, and again, it's a fascinating form function and allows people who are not in the marketplace to get in the marketplace. It allows you to try a lot of stuff. But we think what we're going to see is a natural migration within the marketplace. So we did size our vehicle for substantially larger than a CubeSat, somewhere between 150 and 500 kilograms. So we're looking more at the small refrigerator size payloads. And we had some fascinating dialogues. And recently with NASA, JPL, we were talking about some of their wacky ideas for doing small sats to the planets. So there's a tremendous revolution going on. And do we have it right? Well, no. We've kind of got the satellites ahead of the launch vehicles at the moment, but the launch vehicles are trying to respond to that demand signal. And so it's a really dynamic area that we're living in right now. But I think the message I'm trying to say is this is how markets are supposed to work. Is everyone going to be successful? Of course not. It's like being worried about how many new restaurants in New York City are going to succeed or fail. A bunch of new restaurants are going to start. A lot of them are going to succeed. Some of them are not. The same is going to be true in this industry. So we're working on two separate products. I'm not going to talk about the beautiful vehicle on the left. That's the spaceship in the White Knight. It's in test flight now out in Mojave, California. And that is designed to take humans up to space and bring them back. let them experience microgravity for a while. And it's also designed to fly payloads, and we've gotten a lot of interest from NASA and other space agencies about flying suborbital payloads. I'm going to focus today on the Launcher 1, which is the vehicle focused on this new launch industry. Again, what is key, we've talked about this, you need, we think what the market needs is a dedicated vehicle that can take payloads where they want to go, when they want to go, at a cost that they can afford. This is a vehicle that's about $12 million. It's all composite, very straightforward, very simple technology, locks kerosene, not pushing the state of the art on anything. The focus is to create a vehicle that's manufacturable at a much cheaper price. And so to get a vehicle that's available in the market that can fly a lot, that can fly to where people want to go. Will people use bigger vehicles? Yes, like Planet just used PSLV to launch, was it 80, I think, 84 of their satellites at the same time. People are going to so OneWeb will use the Soyuz. People are going to use the bigger vehicles to populate whole orbits, but they will always need a separate vehicle to do infill, to respond to any malfunctions they might have, to test out new technologies. So we think that demands are going to be there for both, and we think it's going to be a healthy and robust environment. I want to end on a couple of slides that echo what Steve said, that the fascinating thing from a national security perspective is these new tools that we're creating bring new capabilities to the marketplace. So you now have a launch platform in the 747 that has a 2,000-mile range, 2,000-kilometer range. So all of a sudden, you open up a potential tremendous capability that you didn't have before. You're not locked in one launch site. You don't have one launch angle that you can shoot to. You can go out over the ocean. You can launch in almost any orbit, and you have the ability to go out and hover and wait. It introduces new capabilities that have never existed before in national security space. You also have the ability to rapidly reconstitute. These are vehicles that are designed to fly a lot, launch a lot, so you have the ability to go up and do payloads. Obviously, you would have to do some stockpiling in advance to make it make sense, but it's a new capability. You're freed from the traditional ground structure. Everything we need to fly, we're using trailers. We're using 3 trailers today. Everything we need to fly can actually be loaded in our own 747. So all the ground support equipment can be palletized, loaded on the airplane, flown to any place that we need to fly that has a 10,000-foot runway, and we have an instant launch site. So again, back to Steve's point, there's been a lot of talk about the threat to our current space assets. We agree, as Steve has said, that some investment now in that investment is small. Again, I don't know if it's 1% or 2%, but it's a very small investment to start replicating some of the very expensive capabilities with this new generation of capabilities, so that if anything does happen, we have the ability to exercise that and to have those capabilities and the capabilities the warfighter needs in an uninterrupted fashion. Thank you.
Thanks, Rich. I want to start off with a question similar to the last panel about resilience. And it strikes me, one of the things that I find interesting about this space market is the areas where the commercial and the government sector overlap. Now, there's a lot of areas where they don't overlap. There's things that the government does in space that the commercial industry probably isn't going to do, maybe I should say hopefully isn't going to do in some cases. But there's a lot of areas where there's some real similarities, and it strikes me that it's very likely, and I'd be interested in the panel's thoughts, that resilience is kind of a common need on both sides. I think of the classic Verizon commercials. I think they still do them. That "Are you there yet?" Or "Can you hear me now?" Right? When you pick up your phone, you turn it on, it has to work. Right? That is the one baseline. All the time, a requirement on the commercial sector is when your customer wants to use your service, it better be there for them, right? So they can't afford to have, if you're relying on a satellite layer as a commercial provider, you're going to need to be able to rapidly reconstitute it if something goes wrong. Similarly, what I'd like to explore is the extent to which that overlaps with some of the DoD needs to ensure that its must-have capabilities in space are there as well. And I would just be interested in how much similarity or how much difference there might be between the commercial imperative and the national security imperative when it comes to the ability to have a resilient capability in space and to be able to reconstitute it. And just anyone on the panel who wants to dive in.
I'd be happy to kick it off. I think it's going to be a one-to-one correlation. I mean, obviously, within the defense and intelligence community, there has to be a paradigm shift so that they are embracing the rapid change for capabilities they're actually relying on. But if you look at the way the industry works today, you have companies building satellites that are at any one point always 2 to 3 years away from their launch. So they commit to building a satellite. It takes up to 24 months to do that, and then they are trying to, at the same time, to get the launch contracts in place. So the horizon of a launch is always like about 3 years away. And what we're offering is the ability to rapidly accelerate that pace. Somebody on the previous panel mentioned that Planet is in the 14th generation of their satellites already. But Planet, although they're incredibly creative as a company, are still stuck in the old launch paradigm where they're waiting for years to get up into space. So what we want to do is revolutionize that, and I think that'll have direct implications for both DoD and for the commercial sector.
Yeah, I think there's a happy convergence of interests here as well between commercial and defense things, particularly in launch. What's interesting to me is when we talk about resilience, most of the time folks are thinking about resilience in space. You know, do I have enough assets in space, and are they going to survive? On the defense side, are they going to survive, you know, some sort of contested situation? On the commercial side, are they going to fail for some other reason? And we also think about resilience on the ground side of things. But what's interesting is there's not a lot of discussion about resilience in launch. And I think in the overlap in the two is really the responsive nature of launch, which actually with air launch that both Rich and I are involved in is enhanced by being able to avoid, you know, what could be if this launch rate happens as it's projected there, there's going to be massive traffic jams at the fixed sites. And so for a commercial launch, if you have the ability to bypass that traffic jam and kind of take the city bypass, and in our case, we can fly out over the oceans, avoid weather, avoid boats, avoid air traffic, you know, that just adds to your responsiveness. On the military side, those same attributes you know, allow you to launch even if something were to happen to those fixed launch sites, which could very well happen since they're right on the coastlines, and it would be you know, fairly easy for an adversary to do something that would inhibit launches from those sites. And so I think that's a nice convenient overlap. I think in both cases, though, there's also the idea that the need to buy launch systems ahead of need, where you're not just, and I think Rich kind of alluded to this, you're not just, you know, I'm going to project my launch to be at such and such date, and I will buy my launch then. You know, we actually need to have some stockpiling of launch systems so that if something were to happen, if in the commercial world there was some hole in the constellation that suddenly developed, you know, can you rapidly refill that hole? That means you need to have that launcher already procured and sitting on the ground and ready to go. And so, I think that need exists in both the commercial world and the defense market. There are other attributes. Maybe I'll wait to see if those come up in another question.
Yeah, Andrew, I'm not sure that I understand your question about resilience, but I think I do. Let me just say, the U.S. military has been looking at the commercial satellite and launch services industry for years. I think there's a realization within the U.S. military that the current system that they have for procurement of satellites, for procurement of launch services, isn't really working so well. It's too expensive. The U.S. military has many, many more satellites that they'd love to build and launch, but they can't because they don't have enough money to get them up there at current launch prices with the limited number of launch vehicles that they have available to them. I mean, U.S. military satellites generally have launched on deltas or atlases in general. You don't see them being launched by Protons or Arianes. Now they're being launched by Falcons at a much cheaper cost. So this is good for the U.S. military. They'll be launching a lot more satellites. The U.S. military is also looking very seriously at hosted payloads, obviously, putting their imaging payloads or communications payloads on commercial satellites that are going to geostationary or going to low Earth orbit. These offer some incredible advantages in terms of pricing and also flexibility, getting your payloads up there very quickly when you need them. But remember that there is a certain culture within the U.S. military, and that culture isn't going to change overnight. The U.S. military is a very conservative culture, and they basically want they want cheaper prices. They want the flexibility to get their payloads up there, but they also want control. And so at some point, they're going to have to compromise, and that process is happening as we speak, but it's going to develop very, very slowly. But I think ultimately in the future, the U.S. military is going to become much more liberal in the way they procure launch services and how they develop and build their satellites and where they put their payloads, because what they want is affordability and they want timeliness.
Well, I think that leads nicely into the next topic area, again, similar to the first panel, in terms of how the government realistically can participate in a positive way to capitalize on the potential development in this small satellite market, if it's there. So as you've said, right, there is a standard government approach. I would maybe say especially in the space area. The government tends to be fairly traditional in all areas, but I would say maybe especially in the space area. But on the other hand, as you point out with Falcon, this is one of those areas where, surprisingly enough, the departure from the traditional model has happened. It's not just underway, it's actually happened. And we have commercial launch services approach being done, and evolution of new launch families well underway. That's on the big end, though, on the big launch end. So where might the government seek to go? It's investing jointly with private companies on the big launch side. That may or may not be a useful model for the small launch side, but where might the government think to play a positive role in the launching of these smaller satellites as an investor, as a customer, potentially as a regulator? What are kind of the key things the government should be doing to kind of help foster this and or take advantage of it if it's there?
I would say to play and participate is the big one. Right now, from our understanding of where things stand in the national security realm, there's a sense of, let's wait and kind of see how these turn out, and we're not going to get in your way, but at the same time, we're not going to really do much until we see things actually happen. And I guess I kind of understand that perspective in one sense. On another hand, we're already, both of our companies and others that Rich showed among the next generation launch folks are all, their systems are pretty much ready to go in the next year or two. We're well within budget, the normal DoD budget cycles in terms of they could start now and they'd still be late to the party in terms of starting to budget for these things. And so that would be one point. And the other is, I think it is time for them to play. I think that this alternative architecture is very compelling for their use. I think depending on how serious you think the threat is, will ultimately be the driver here. If the threat is real and it's compelling and it's here on top of us, then they really need to move out. And I think just starting to say, yes, we want to start doing experiments. We want to start putting up these small satellites in low Earth orbit that demonstrate the capabilities that we have in the Russ constellation, and we want to do that in a way that also demonstrates our ability to be responsive and resilient. It's time for them to start getting on that and start procuring those kind of services from us and Virgin and the other companies.
Oh, you want to go? Yeah, I think that the government's role for this industry should be to find ways to facilitate the growth of new launch companies. One way to do that certainly is to find ways to invest in launch sites. You don't have that many launch sites, really. Most of the launches that occur from the United States occur from 2 or 3 different launch sites, occur from Wallops, or occur from Florida, occur from California. There are launch sites. There are launch spaceports in Alaska, a spaceport in New Mexico, and other states, but there probably need to be a lot more because if you're looking at potentially tens of thousands of satellites by companies, they're proposing to build them like SpaceX and Boeing and others, you're really talking about launching potentially thousands of satellites a year. We've never seen this before. I mean, the last time you had 1,000 satellites launched in one, I can't remember that in the last 20, 25 years. So, if this is going to happen, you're going to need more launch vehicles. Those launch vehicles are going to have to reduce their turnaround times. They can't be launching once a month. That's just not going to do it. They're going to have to be launching once a week, once every few days. That's why some of these systems that are reusable systems, like Launcher One and Stratolaunch, I'm sorry. Those are good systems because they are reusable launch systems, just like the Falcon 9 is now a partially reusable launch vehicle. The current architecture for most launch systems isn't going to work because they're just not launching. They can't launch fast enough for this new market that we're talking about. So you're going to have to launch a lot more, but you need more launch sites because you can't really launch that many times from these current launch sites that we have. So I think the government can certainly find ways to help develop more spaceports, launch sites in this country.
So actually, I think this is actually one of the harder issues for the government to get their mind around, which is they see this phenomena happening and they ask, what should we do? And I think if we rewind the tape to the 90s and the satellite communications revolution that was taking place, there were a lot of people saying, well, you shouldn't build wideband satellites, you shouldn't build MUOS for the Navy, narrowband comms for the Navy, because all this capacity is going to be there. And then what happened when a lot of those companies went bankrupt is the people who thought you should be supporting the private sector said you didn't support it enough, and the people who thought that you shouldn't be supporting the private sector said, see, we were right all along, this is just, smoke and mirrors, and the only way to have capability is to build it yourself. And I think we've struggled from the 90s to where we are now, and I think what I am more afraid of the government investing in bad ideas than I am in the government not investing. So I think what the role of government is right now is to take small bets. Like NASA created a very tiny program, I think total program was like $17 million, called VCLS. And they went out to get 3 separate launch contracts of companies that hadn't flown yet. And so they took a very small bet. If everybody fails, that the loss isn't that significant. It could be that their participation at the front end could have a profound effect on those companies. And so we were one of the companies that got a VCLS award, so I should say that out there. I think what NGA is doing with the imagery industry is very positive, being a buyer. NOAA is trying to get their mind around the idea of commercial data buys, and they're struggling mightily to get there. They're not there yet. But again, the idea that there could be data that NOAA could purchase and that could go into their overall. So I think rather than say that the government has to rush in on a white horse and save my system, I think what I'd rather say is the government needs to be smart. It needs to take small bets. It needs to be a partner, and it needs to let things fail. the last thing we need is the government, sort of lemon socialism, the government writing in saving systems that aren't stable in the marketplace. So I think it's a really tough question, and I think that we've been working on it for the last 20 years. I don't think we're there yet.
You've walked into my trap. My next question, which is, there's been a couple of references here to, and it's natural, and I think it makes sense, early stage kinds of launch capability that your two companies are going to provide, but then additional capability down the road. And so it kind of gets, Rich, to your comments about, are there clear technology gap areas where we're close or that we need to close to kind of get to make these projections, that are ambitious and optimistic, to make those real? And so Marco talked about on the launch infrastructure side, both of your systems are essentially designed to go after that problem. But are there other technology gap areas on the launch side that we're going to have to make progress or close, or that you're planning to close to get there?
I think a lot of the systems, this was referenced in the last panel, whether you're trying to build 500 satellites, or whether you're trying to build a resilient, rapid, low-cost launch vehicle, you've got to come at it. First of all, rate is got to be critical. You can't lower the cost if you're building 3 a year. Okay, you've got to be able to invest in manufacturing. You've got to be able to invest in automation. And we are all looking, the industry, I know Rocket Lab and us, and I know several other people are looking at additive manufacturing for actually building whole engine parts. So, building an engine is still a really expensive, time-consuming process. And so to the extent that we can introduce automation and drive the cost down dramatically, we're not looking at a couple of percent improvement. We need 30, 40, 50, 60% improvement. So I think all of us are looking at what's available in the advanced manufacturing realm. Again, not to create new technologies that don't exist, but to take advantage in a smart sense of what does exist, so that we can bring that sort of rapid manufacturing concept into the aerospace industry in a way that it hasn't been before.
Yeah, Rich, I think that was well put. I'm not aware of, at least for us, any major technology gaps that need to be filled. I think that mostly what we're doing is taking advantage of what currently exists, and additive manufacturing is the one that is the most exciting at the moment. I think, probably in a larger sense, we have an interesting, perplexing problem in how we value various things in space. If you look at the total space ecosystem and think about, building satellites, launching satellites, operating satellites, and then providing data that comes from the satellites to some customer user, there's a very interesting mix of where the value system comes or falls out. One, we heard and I'm kind of teasing something here in a second, but in the panel we heard before, and by the way, in the panel I hear every time I go to a conference, the issue with small satellites, the issue with space is really launch. We hear that, everywhere we go. So launch is where the bottlenecks are actually, to creating all kinds of downstream wealth for folks. What's interesting though is launch actually turns out to be a very, very small part of the space ecosystem. It's only 0.5% of the total space thing. So if you looked at 2016, the amount of money that was launched, and this is a Euroconsult projection or report, but it says 1.3 billion for launch, 217 billion for launch services, 4 billion for building satellites, 14 billion for operating satellites. Racking out those percentages, launch is just a small percentage of that. And yet it's the bottleneck that uncorks, where the real money is, which is in the data services. So if we can sort of align our value system, if launch is the bottleneck, and it really is not a big cost component, then why not release that bottleneck and actually invest in it in a greater extent? And I think that's true both in commercial and the national security realms, is don't let launch be your bottleneck. Go ahead and spend money on it and and realize that the real value comes later when you get your satellites up in orbit. But that's not going to happen unless you spend the money on the launch first.
All right, we've reached that time where we're going to open up to audience questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. And I did want to add, I feel compelled to say, I think we've talked about what the government can or should do. I do want to point out that there are folks in the government thinking pretty hard about this. The Air Force had put out a report recently they entitled Fast Space that they have been, that deals with a number of these issues. I also have to tell you that CSIS did a report called Ultra Low Cost Access to Space, which looked at some of these issues, which you ought to check out. And with that, I'm going to turn to an audience question back here.
Sure. Hi, Victoria Sampson, Secure World Foundation. I'm curious, building off the statement that Bahia made in the last panel about how there are over 70 countries involved in small sats, I'm wondering, what is the launch industry doing to internationalize yourselves? Or are they just considered small fish and you'd rather focus on the U.S. domestic industry? And along those lines, if you're trying to internationalize yourselves for small sats, is export control an issue for you guys?
Yeah, that's a painful subject matter. Because we're in the launch vehicle industry, we're captured under the Missile Technology Control Regime. So it's not only just normal export control, it's export control on steroids. There's a presumption of denial for the transfer of, I'm greatly simplifying the rules, but there's a presumption of denial for the export of missile equipment to non-launch nations. So I think in all of our dialogues, we do have the broader international community in mind, and we do want to play in an international forum. We've had a number of initial dialogues with the State Department about selling services, things like doing campaigns abroad, and these are really new ideas for them. Like, SpaceX or ULA never came to the State Department and said, hey, we'd like to launch out of, Italy or something like that. So, I mean, this is new, and anything new and the word new and export control don't go in the same sentence ever. So we asked the State Department a year and a half ago if a 747 was an airplane, and they still haven't answered us. So we thought that was an easy one, but not easy.
We share the same issues on this and the same interests, I think. I see great interest on our part to launch other folks' stuff. I don't know that anything would stop us from doing that in the U.S. From our normal launch locations that we're considering. It gets tricky if we think about trying to launch the aircraft overseas.
Hi, Bahia Law from the Science and Technology Policy Institute. I want to follow up on Victoria's question on international issues. So the U.S. launch industry is going to be competing with PSLVs and now the GSLV, as well as the Chinese space sector. So I think X-Space, this Chinese company, launched a 300 or 150 kilogram payload for $3 million. I'm not sure how much PSLV costs, but it doesn't cost as much as the ULA launch. So what are your thoughts on how we would compete internationally?
That's another really good question. I mean, our view of the world, Virgin Galactic's view of the world is, competition is good as long as it's fair. And so, we're in an environment where the reason that China is not in the Western launch business doesn't have anything to do with trade restrictions. It has to do with national security restrictions that went into place after Tiananmen Square. So, we don't have we have the Chinese out, but the Russians are in. India recently signed the MTCR and is now kind of a full member of the community. So I think that we're going to face increasing competition from international players around the globe, and I think it is a difficult industry because we are so affiliated with missiles and missile technology. But I think that we're going to face a lot of international competition, and we just have to be, like SpaceX, you just have to be aggressively driving technology and getting the costs under control. And you have to be competitive on a global scale. The only objection we would have is when we're up against people who are getting unfair subsidies, and that's going to be a tricky, given the acknowledged close alignment between the launch industries and the other industries of other countries. Parsing what is a fair support against what is a outright subsidy is going to be complicated.
Oh, go ahead.
Our mantra is convenience, reliability, and routine access to LEO. And we want to create a customer experience that is that is a wonderful experience like you might have in other kind of consumer things. And we may end up costing more than some very, very low cost foreign provider, but we're going to make up for that in convenience. I mean, there's a difference between trying to get your satellite, if you're developing it in Silicon Valley and shipping it to India or someplace like that versus going down the street to Mojave.
It's not American payload going to U.S. or China. It's Filipino payload or a Thai. I mean, it's international competition.
Yeah. So then it's a shootout either in schedule, because it's not just cost. I mean, it's schedule is a huge thing. If a launch is delayed or if there's difficulty getting into the country or there's some sort of security concerns that make it difficult to get approvals, that's schedule. And for small satellites, schedule is a huge thing when you're trying to go to Series B investment and you can't prove that your Series A satellite worked because you're sitting on a pad somewhere or you can't get it launched. And so schedule is going to be a really big thing for anyone around the world. And so if we can do a better job with that and be within a zone of cost, we think that's going to be the secret.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. If even a fraction of the satellites that are being proposed to be built and launched actually happen, there's going to be plenty of business for everybody. I mean, this is a rich market if it actually does happen. I'm much more optimistic about systems like my colleagues here are developing because they are the ones that are in a position to actually reduce the time between launches. The Long March family of vehicles is modern. It's an excellent family of vehicles. And the number of missions they're launching every year is increasing every year. I think in the last few years they've increased to over 15 or 16 missions per year, and very well reliable vehicles. So they're in a position to compete against traditional launch companies very, very well, but I don't see these as traditional launch companies. If they can start getting a fair amount of business early on and start launching on a monthly and then on a weekly basis successfully without any accidents or failures, then their prices per mission are going to drop dramatically, I would expect. And I don't think traditional launch vehicles like the Long March family of vehicles or the PSLVs of the world or the GSLVs are going to be able to match this. As you see what's happening with SpaceX and Falcon 9, everybody's trying to play catch up with SpaceX. I mean, the Europeans are scared to death. Boeing and Lockheed, I think, are scared to death because there's just no way that they can develop and deploy launch vehicles that would be able to offer prices anywhere close to what Falcon 9 offers and still make a profit. The Europeans are still expensive. They're getting plenty of business, but they're still fairly expensive. But they're barely making a profit, even with subsidies. And they can't, even with these current prices, even with subsidies, they still can't compete on price with Falcon 9. And Falcon 9 is going to get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper as it becomes more reusable.
Thank you. Hi, Sandra Irwin, a reporter with Real Clear Defense. I don't know if you guys follow the nuclear triad, but there's going to be a big program with the next generation ICBM, and I was just wondering what you guys thought about the impact on the space sector. Potentially there would be some investments or new technologies needed for that effort. Thank you.
Well, I saw General Hyten was in comments the other day talking about how slow the acquisition system is. So maybe he would appreciate more responsive launch capability when it. That's probably not the market you're aiming to go into. But is there any overlap, or is there any way in which the launch systems being developed, this explosion and launch would facilitate or make it easier for the government to procure ICBM launchers, or are those entirely different classes of launchers?
Mr. Appropriator.
Yeah, the Pegasus is a solid motor, and so we would actually benefit if people were pouring large amounts of large ICBMs again. That would just reduce our costs, so that would be a benefit to us, I think. I think on the flip side is what maybe, I don't know, was being suggested, is that we're looking at monster expenditures on recapitalizing the triad, and could that squeeze out investments that are required in space? And I mean, that would be definitely a concern. I don't know if folks saw that today in the news, the House Armed Services Committee has mandated in their bill, and they'll have to go to conference and everything, but the Space Corps. And so this would be a new office in the Air Force, co-equal footing with the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, but there would be a Chief of Staff of the Space Corps that would be responsible for space. And something like that, if one thing I do think of in terms of both the Marine Corps and the old Army Air Corps is, if nothing else, they're very good at advocating for themselves, and so hopefully that might offset whatever drain of resources might come from having to recapitalize the triad.
I think they're pretty good at warfighting too, but just have to get that in there in case there's any Marines in the room. Okay, question here.
Jeff Faust, Space News. Smallsat developers have traditionally been very price sensitive when it comes to launch. Otherwise, we would have seen a lot more Pegasus launches over the years than we have. How do you time the market so that your dedicated launches are really going to catch up to this growing demand from smallsat developers? In other words, what's going to make smallsat developers less price sensitive and more willing to fly dedicated launch and take advantage of all the other rideshare opportunities that are out there?
First of all, I do agree with you that what we've seen, particularly the smaller startups, the CubeSats, and 3U, 6U, people who are relying on 3U and 6U satellites, there's a extreme price sensitivity in the market, and I think that the market, our assumption is twofold. Number one is that there are other players in the marketplace who are not in that startup class who will start creating demand in the marketplace. And those people will be driven more by schedule and the ability to rapidly go when they want to go. I think it always will make sense if you're populating a large constellation to look for the most affordable way to do that. So whether you're a OneWeb or a Planet or a SpaceX, you're going to look at, what's the biggest vehicle that I can use to put a bunch of satellites up at one time. And I think that's where we are in the growth of this market. People are trying to populate the initial constellations. Once you do that, it makes less sense for like a Planet to ride on a secondary on a large vehicle that's going somewhere they don't want to go. And then the value of what we're offering changes for them. So I think that what we'll see is a maturation of this marketplace, and I think we'll see people migrating towards our services in a way that is less price conscious than you're seeing today.
In terms of Pegasus, think what's interesting about it is it turns out it's like everything else in life. If you buy it in quantity, the price comes way down. Right now, Pegasus is being launched like once every 1 or 2 years, and we're if you're looking at these kind of charts, you're talking about launches every month, a couple every month, every week, that kind of thing. And so when you start talking about those kind of quantities, the Pegasus vehicle will get down to a very competitive level, and that's really what we're excited about. I think beyond that, the other thing that dedicated launch gives you, besides the potential to launch on a better schedule, is also launch into the tailored orbit that you really care about. And that's right now, if you're a CubeSat or some sort of small satellite and you want to go to orbit, you're probably either going to the space station or to a sun synchronous orbit. And if you want to deviate from that, you're kind of you're out of luck right now. And so that's another thing that I think our capabilities will provide, is the ability to go to very tailored orbits that right where someone needs to go for their business case.
I think we have time for one last question up here with Aaron.
Hi, thanks. Aaron Rodgers, APL. So a question, as you think about in the future, is your expectation that you would build multi-payload manifests as comers come to you with various sizes and shapes of satellites to launch, or perhaps push that to the residual capacity to the secondary market?
We're gonna probably go both ways on that.
Yeah, and we are too. We're going to do a lot of stuff ourselves internally, but we're also going to be open to working with the big integrators. There's a lot of great products, dispensers being created on the market right now, and so you'll be able to buy a lot of this stuff. You'll be able to buy a lot of this stuff on the marketplace. And so a mix, for sure.
All right. Well, Aaron, I think you get the honors of the last question. I want to thank everyone for coming today to this two-panel session, and for the vast majority sticking around, and hopefully the coffee helped with that, and also the great dialogue. And please join me in thanking our panelists for a great discussion.